Well, good evening, Uganda students. Great to see you again. Well, I actually don't see you, but great to be seen by you. We're going to get started here in just a minute. So we're just talking about a gentleman by the name of Reuben Kagame.
Kagame.
Yeah, Kagame. And you know Daniel. Oh, we have a guest here. Can you say something? Say hi. Who are you?
I'm Courtney Kelly.
That's
Nice
Courtney.
to meet you.
She's just sitting in on this class, so yeah. Anyway, Daniel, as you remember, is from his hometown is in Eldoret, Kenya, and so I think I've sent you links to a gentleman by the name of Reuben Kagame, who is a African apologetics person. He's also a musician. Actually, he's probably more famous as a musician. And he's also blind, so amazing man. I just bought and downloaded a book he wrote, which is called Christian Apologetics Through African Eyes. Very interested to see what he has to say. So I just got it, and I can't comment on it yet, but I will let you know what I think. And it could be a great resource. And he, along with the gentleman that you've met before from the Africa Center for Apologetics Research, those people are doing great apologetics work in Africa. And I sent you a link. I'm kind of talking to everybody. I sent you a link about a gentleman from the United States, who I don't know, I know of, but I've never met him, but he's giving a 2-week seminar in Zambia on apologetics. And I think I said in my note on WhatsApp that those kind of events are exactly what I hope can start taking place more and more in Africa, in East Africa, in Western Uganda, in Ishaka. And you guys are the foundation that can help make that happen. So anyway, that's my vision, that's my passion, that like I said when I came and visited you, that what an awesome opportunity to raise up a new generation of apologists in Africa. So let's do it together. Okay, and these guys here are part of that, guys and gals, because I'm sure that someday they might think about taking what they're learning here and coming and visiting you and encouraging you and celebrating these great, amazing reasons that we have to believe in you. So, okay, with that said, you know how on YouTube you can put 1.5x speed and watch it fast? I'm going to do that today because today is going to be a short class, because I am leaving as soon as I can to drive all the way up to Canada, because there's an apologetics conference in Abbotsford, Canada, and I'm excited to see that, so I need to get up there. So that being said, I'm going to whip us through the first part of a very important argument, and I'm just going to give us a little bit of background. I always like to remind ourselves where we've been, where we're going. So where we've been is we're laying down this foundation. So we're almost halfway through the class. By the time we get through the next class, we'll have laid the foundation for the existence of a God. Okay? We're not even saying it's got to be the Christian God yet. All of these arguments could be argued for the Christian God and point it to, but it could also just be a general God. Okay, so those foundational arguments have been these arguments from what we see in physical reality, both why there's something rather than nothing, and why did the universe begin to exist. And then we took a look at this amazing design that we find in the universe, purpose that we find in the universe, both through the telescope as we look out into the cosmos, but also through the microscope as we look at how life works. So on the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, from purpose, telos, the end goal. Remember Jesus said on the cross, it is finished. tetelestai. That means it's finished. I've reached the end goal of what I came to do. When I came as Emmanuel, God in the flesh, I came to die for the sins of believers. Okay? So the teleological argument took those two forms. I have to say that one area of growth for me personally is to understand what we were talking about last time about design in life better. I want to understand biology better so I can speak more authoritative on these arguments from biology, from what we see in nature, when we see the operation of the internal structure of even the simplest forms of life. That just screams out design. This didn't just happen by accident. The processes that have been proposed, the natural processes, primarily Darwinian evolution, simply don't accomplish what has to be accomplished in order for life to exist. From it to go from raw material chemicals to the first life, nor from the first life to the incredible diversity of life that we see through the history of Earth. So I'm watching some biology tutorials and stuff, and really trying to get myself better educated on that. So now we're going to turn our attention to the last of the big foundational arguments, which is probably one of the most powerful ones. Before we get to that, I just want to plot a course on where we're going. After we lay down these foundational arguments for the existence of a God, we're going to stop for a minute and we're going to deal with probably the biggest challenge we have to the existence of this being that we call God, and that is the problem of evil and suffering. Because generally speaking, when we talk about God, we're talking about an all-powerful, all-benevolent, all-loving being. And so the obvious question is, well, if there is this all-powerful, all-good, all-loving being, why did he create this world where there's all this suffering and evil? And you can say, well, there's sin, and so really it's not God responsible, it's man responsible. He sinned, so all this evil and suffering is a result of that somehow. But then you can ask the question, well, then if he knew this was going to happen, why did he create it this way? Why didn't he just create it so it was all perfect? Isn't that what he was trying to do? And he blew it. So if he blew it, he must not be all powerful, or he must not be all loving. So this is the single biggest objection that comes up when we're talking about the existence of God. Okay, so we're going to deal with that. Then once we get done with that, then we're going to move on from the general God to the specific God. And we're going to do that through looking at the life of Christ. We're going to look primarily at his death and his resurrection. His death, and then his death is nothing miraculous. His resurrection is the most miraculous thing ever. So we're going to establish good reason why we believe in the resurrection of Christ. And it's timely because we're coming up to Easter, which is when we celebrate Easter, or we celebrate the resurrection. And so, each one of these things, I should say, what I'm hoping to do in this class is just whet your appetite, give you a little bit of a taste. I taught an entire class on the moral argument. So it's a big subject, and you can go down, so we're only going to take one or actually two classes to cover it. I've been wanting, someday I want to teach a class entirely on this problem because it is such a big problem. Then the resurrection, I taught an entire class on defending the resurrection. So each one of these can be its own class that's 15 weeks, or it could be even longer. So we're just getting a taste of that. So, all right, so let's move on to this moral argument, which is basically, in a nutshell, it's asking the question, just like we asked the question of, where did the universe come from? Well, if it came into being, there had to be something that caused it to come into being. So God is the cause of it coming into being. Same question we're asking, but we're applying to this idea of morals. It's like we have this idea of morality, things that are right and wrong, good and bad, things the way things ought to be, the way things should be, what we should do. All of these things that are like they're like either commands or just value judgments about reality. And the question is, where do those values and duties come from? It's probably one of the most persuasive arguments for God, because we as human beings have a built-in sense of morality. Okay, it's unavoidable. So built into our very fabric of being is what we usually call our conscience, which is telling us, what's right and what's wrong. It gives us a sense of guilt if we do what's wrong. And so we have a personal experience with these things, whereas some of the other arguments, it's like they can kind of seem like, wow, that's pretty far out. I don't know about cosmology. I don't know about this. I look at, okay, there's the stars, but that's about all I can say. Or, I've heard about how the cells work, but I have no idea how they really work. But here, it's like, man, we feel it in our soul. We know that there is this thing called good and bad, right and wrong. And Scripture affirms this, that we have this built-in sense of morality, because in Romans chapter 2, it talks about how not only for the Jews who are given the law from God, but even the Gentiles have this built-in sense of the law, even though it's not the Jewish law with a capital L, it's the little law, which is this conscience that both affirms us and condemns us. Okay, so we have this built in. So the question that this chapter and this moral argument is asking is can we be good without God? In other words, is God necessary for there to be good, that we can then be good? It's not asking, and this is really important, keep this in mind, it's not asking this question, can we be good without belief in God? Okay, so oftentimes when the charge is made that you need God in order for good to exist, or you need God if you're going to be good, then the non-believer will say, hey, I'm a good person. I do all this great stuff. I feed the starving children, I dig the wells, I take care of, I try to be as good a person as I can, and yet I don't believe God exists. And so it's not necessarily the case that a person can't do good things without belief in God. Okay, without belief in God. But the question is, if God doesn't exist, then do we have any reason to believe that this good or bad is actually real? And of course, the conclusion, just jumping to the conclusion, is that actually we need God for there to be such thing as good or evil. We need a measure. We need some source of these moral values and duties in order for them to have any sense of reality. And if God doesn't exist, then those things don't exist. Okay, and if those things don't exist, then we obviously can't be, quote, good. Okay, so that's the gist of the argument. And here's how the formulation goes. And there's many ways to present this, but this is the way William Lane Craig presents it. He says this, it's very simple and straightforward, and it's a Loctite logical argument, and it goes like this. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. In other words, that objective morals and duties require God's existence for them to exist. And if God's not there, then they don't exist. Okay, so that's premise one, and we'll have to talk about what these mean, and we'll have to dig into whether we believe this premise or not. The second premise is that, well, objective moral values and duties do exist. We know it in our souls, and we can tell whether there's things that are right and wrong, good or evil. And so we say, yes, they do exist. And if that's the case, then it logically follows, then therefore God must exist. Okay, so that's the basic idea of the argument. Now there's a different way that you can look at that first premise, and if it's helpful, you can do this. You can logically flip it around, and instead of saying kind of in a negative form, if God doesn't exist, then these things don't exist, you can say it in a positive form, and that would be this. If objective moral values and duties do exist, then God exists. Okay, the one follows the other, because the only source, the claim of the premise, and we need to talk through this, we need to justify this premise, is that the claim of the premise is that yes, that only if God exists do, well, no, sorry, I'm getting it backwards. If these things do exist, then they must find their source of existence in God. Therefore, God must exist. Okay, so that's another way you can think of it. So let's go through, and is this screen flickering or is that just me? It's like hypnotizing me. Going to give me a seizure. So let's go through some definitions, and these definitions are pretty important, and you'll see why their distinction is important. So what are moral values? Moral values are things that have goodness or badness associated with them. In other words, we can say that the moral value of loving your neighbor is good. Like if you were to judge loving your neighbor, that has a moral value associated with it, that it's good. It's good to love your neighbor. And the flip side, of course, is that the moral value of murdering your neighbor is bad. Okay, so we're associating some kind of moral weight, moral judgment to something, and that's in terms of, is it good or is it bad, or good or evil. And many things fall into that category. Moral duties are then things that are right or wrong. They're things that have rightness or wrongness associated with them. And so we have a moral duty to love our neighbor, and we have a moral duty not to murder our neighbor, okay? Because those things are right or wrong actions. So duties are more things that we ought to do or ought not to do. And moral values are judging, assigning some kind of moral weight, moral value, hence the name, to something. Okay, so the moral values perhaps are more associated with propositions or statements that are either right or good statements or bad statements reflecting a good quality or a bad quality. Moral duties are more things that people are called to action, either to do or not to do. Okay, so that's one distinction between moral values and moral duties. And in general, what we're talking about is morality as a whole. That's just the whole subject of oughtness and goodness and badness and evil. So the other key thing that we really have to get our minds around is when we're talking about these moral values and duties, morality, we need to distinguish between two types or two ways to talk about it. One is objective, okay, objective morality. The other is subjective morality. And this is really important because it starts bringing into the question of where are these moral things located. So with objective, what does objective mean? It means that it's describing something about the object itself, hence objective. So when we say something we're talking about an objective thing, we're talking about the thing itself, something about the thing. whatever that thing is. When we're talking about subjective, we're not talking about the thing, we're talking about how a person is. It's describing a person's part in that whole thing that we're talking about. So objective statements have to do with the thing itself. Subjective statements have to do with the person who is involved in the thing. Okay, that's the key distinction. So, for example, if I were to say it's wrong to torture babies for fun, what I'm talking about is the object of this statement is wrong to torture babies for fun. The object of that is this act of torturing babies for fun. And when I'm referring to it as objectively wrong, what I'm saying is that torturing babies, that's the object, is wrong in and of itself. It's not really talking about whether or not I believe it to be right or wrong. It's talking about the thing itself. Okay, the subjective aspect of this would be if I have the belief that torturing babies for fun is wrong and we shouldn't do it. Okay, so it's talking about subjective morality in this case is talking about something about me, like I believe that this is wrong. Okay, the objective is talking about the thing itself. And so what we want to do, ultimately what we want to do is we want to align our subjective beliefs about morality to the truth of the objective morality itself. That's what we want to do. Now, one of the challenges that we'll get to next week when we're getting into whether or not objective morals and values actually exist or not is some people will claim that those don't exist for real, like the statement that it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun, that everything moral-wise is subjective. It's just what we happen to believe. Now, the vast majority of us happen to believe subjectively that it's wrong to torture babies for fun, but that's a description of the human race. It's not a description of the act of torturing babies. So that's an argument that can go up against this idea that the thing itself is has this moral value associated with it, and that thing itself is objectively wrong. Okay, so that hopefully will become more and more clear. When you start really digging into it, the reason why this is important is because if everything, ultimately subjectivity is simply a personal preference, okay? And so a personal preference can be like, I like chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream. There's no objective truth to which one tastes better or not. The whether or not you prefer, whether you think chocolate is better than vanilla, is purely a subjective truth, right? So there are subjective truths. The question is whether things like morality, things like torturing babies for fun, is that just a subjective truth that I prefer that people don't torture babies for fun, or is it really real and independent of me, the thing itself is real? Does that make sense? That's the distinction between those two. And we live in an age where a lot of people think that everything is relative. So you hear the thing, yeah, everything is relative. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And we're only talking about subjective truth. It's like whatever we believe, that's what we believe. And we've gone so far as to say that the epitome of tolerance is acknowledging that subjective reality, that things aren't really objectively true. We can just go with whatever we think, and it's really all just a preference. So ultimately, that the idea of relativism is self-contradictory. because a relativist or subjectivist will make the claim that it's objectively true that relativism is true. Okay, so they'll invoke an objective truth to sustain their subjective worldview. Okay, so that's objective and subjective. The other, here we can learn some fancy lingo, and you can banty it around with caution. And it does have to do with this idea of objectivity and subjectivity. So I want to talk a little bit about two terms, and these are philosophical terms. One is ontology, and one is epistemology. So does anybody have you ever heard these terms before? Probably not. Okay, that's fine. They're not very common terms. So if you haven't heard them, then you probably don't know what they mean. So ontology has to do with being. Okay, it has to do with the nature of things. Has to do with existence itself. Ontology describes like the when we were talking about Leibniz's cosmological argument, we got into contingent things versus necessary things. Okay, and those descriptions, whether something's necessary or contingent, speak to its ontology. Okay, those are characteristics about its very being. Okay, and epistemology speaks to knowledge of things. Okay, so ontology is about being. Epistemology is about knowing. It's about knowing things. Now, how we relate this to morality is that it's one thing to talk about the ontology of morals. Do morals actually exist? Are they like mathematical laws or mathematical expressions that are true regardless of whether we either know them or whether we believe them? Okay, so there's a discussion around the nature of the being of moral things, moral values, moral duties, morality in general. Does it exist, and where does it owe its existence? That's its ontology. The epistemology is about knowing, coming to know what those things are. Okay, what is good and bad? If they exist out there, then what are they? And how do we know what's good, bad, what's right, wrong? So there's a difference between talking about their very existence and whether or not we know what they particularly are. It's kind of like I could say, so do you think that there is the Constitution of the United States? Does it exist? Yeah, right? There's this thing, it's the Constitution, I don't know where it is and what it says, okay? So that's one question. We're talking about, is there this thing, is there this ontological thing that's called the Constitution of the United States? Yes. Okay, so, well, what does it say? What does the Constitution say? In its entirety. I mean, we know snippets and bits and stuff, but I couldn't tell you exactly what it says. I don't know, does it have the Bill of Rights in it? Or I don't know, it has a bunch of stuff. Or let's take even the, do you believe that there is a, I don't know what you call it, but the body of laws that govern the United States, the federal laws, the things that Congress puts into place? Yeah, there's this body, and somewhere there's probably, library full of the laws that govern our nation. And so, yes, it exists somewhere, and it's a body of work. The question is, do I know what those things are? Well, I have, only vaguely. I have a hard time even, I know that there's the 10 Commandments, but I have a hard time like rattling them off. It's like, how do they go again? Okay, steal, covet, murder, adultery, okay. I could probably list them off, but they don't just flow off my tongue. So that's the difference. We can be talking about morals from an ontological standpoint, whether or not they exist, and what do they owe their existence to, or we can be talking about epistemology, what do we know about those? Those are separate topics. And so I want to make sure that as we're going through the argument that we are talking about the ontology right now. When we make the moral argument, we're talking about the nature of the being, the existence of moral laws. We're not necessarily asking the question, okay, so what are those moral laws? What do they consist of? That's this. And epistemology is by nature a subjective thing because it's like knowing, it's a subject knowing about things. Ontology is independent of a subject. Whether or not we know what the right thing to do is in every given situation doesn't mean that there isn't a right thing to do. It means that we may not know what it is, but those are separate questions. Okay, so that's really important. So let me say that again. In the moral argument, we're not talking about whether or not we know what those moral values and duties are. That's epistemology with regards to moral, and there's a whole almost science, and it's called ethics. Ethics is the science. It's the discipline of moral reasoning to try and figure out what is right and what is wrong in any given situation. How do we apply the moral laws and duties that exist? If they exist objectively, then they exist independent of ourselves, so they're things out there to be discovered. That may be another way to think about objective and subjective. Think about the question, are moral laws and duties, is morality something that we go and discover, or are they things that we invent? Okay, so do human beings invent morality, or do we discover morality? Is it something out there that we acknowledge exists and we go and try and figure out what it is, or is it something that comes from within us? Is it subjective to us, or is it objective out there? Okay. One more area of definition, because these things can get confused, and that is the difference between objective morals and absolute morals. Okay, you often hear the two kind of getting a bit mixed up in conversations, in just normal conversations. People will say, the existence of absolute morals, things that are unchanging, proves that God exists. And so let me explain through the difference between objective and absolute. On the one hand, objective simply distinguishes the object from the subject. We're talking about the thing itself out there. Absolute has to do with more about the unchanging nature of that thing, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the thing. So morals can be objective, but not absolute. Okay? So an example could be something like this. It's wrong to abort babies. Okay? And so if we took that as an absolute moral truth, then we would say in no circumstance is it ever right to abort a baby. Now that may be true. That may be an objective truth. But if we add a qualifier to say that we know that A, the baby's going to die, okay? And we know that if the baby dies, then the mom's going to die too. And so let's just assume that the situation is such that both the baby and the mom for sure are going to die unless the baby is aborted. Therefore, the mother will live. So now we're faced with this slightly different circumstance where it could be the case that the lesser of two evils is to go ahead and abort the baby to save the mom, if that's the choice. So it could be the case that the objective moral value is to do the lesser of the two evils. So it may not be the case that that it is wrong to abort babies is an absolute truth, that it isn't affected by the circumstances. So so absolute morals have to do with whether or not something is true under all circumstances. Objective is simply talking about whether that moral value is associated with the thing itself, the act of abortion, or whether it's something that is our belief in that. Okay, they get kind of intertwined, and it's kind of hard to dice them apart sometimes because we can easily flip from talking about the ontology of the moral thing to the epistemology. Like in this example, what is the right response in this circumstance? Okay. Objective morals have an underlying absolute moral principle. So one of the things that is true is that that overarching absolute morals is an objective truth about the morality, and that's why we need to be careful about using the term absolute morality in place of objective morality, because absolute has, number one, has an underlying, I got that backwards. Objective morals have an underlying absolute moral principle that doesn't change. So in this case, the absolute moral principle is that we are to do whatever it is that is the right thing to do. That's really the absolute moral imperative. And moral reasoning, I said this before, is the epistemological process of discovering what is right or wrong, what is good or evil in any situation. Okay, so that's moral reasoning is the science, the discipline that is discovering, okay, in certain situations, what is right and wrong, what is good or bad, and that's the discipline of ethics. Okay, so let's go back now to this first premise and talk a little bit about whether or not we believe this. And I know I'm going over time for break, but I'm just going to go through and then stop, and then you guys will be done. So remember, the first premise is this: if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. It's making the claim that in order for these objective moral values and duties to exist, there has to be a God, and if God doesn't exist, then those things can't exist. So that premise has been challenged. People have said, no, that premise isn't true. The premise could be that objective moral values do exist even without God. So they could have evolved. Okay? So if you buy into the theory of evolution, then these objective moral values and duties could be the adaptation over time of the things that promote human survival. Okay, so if it turns out that that not murdering your neighbor, or even let's take let's take the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That could have evolved because if you put that into practice, then more people will survive. We'll survive as a species. We'll flourish as a species. And so these, and it's objectively true. It is the case, I'm just proposing this, it is the case, say, that if you follow the golden rule, then the species will survive. And so, so that in that sense, that it becomes an objective moral prerogative to obey the golden rule such that the species will increase their probability of survival. So that's one possible source, and we'll get around to digging into those and showing the problem with those. Can anybody think of the problem of that, just right off the bat? Of this statement, that it is our duty, let's just say that it's the golden rule, it is our duty to obey the golden rule because that's the way humans flourish. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that as a foundational basis for objective morals and duties? Sounds pretty convincing to me. Hold that thought. Similarly, this is a more general thing, it could be claimed that good, bad, right, and wrong are by definition the objective things that promote human flourishing, right? It's like, well, duh. It's like there's certain things that you do that make human flourishing happen, and that's what we mean by good and bad. So it's those things that promote human flourishing that are what we call objective moral values and duties. So when we say do not kill, we say that as objectively true because that will promote human flourishing. When we say do not steal, that promotes human flourishing. Do not covet, that promotes human flourishing. So and those things that promote human flourishing is another way to say human survival, which could have been driven by evolutionary processes that lead us to the survival of the fittest, which is what Darwinian evolution is all about. How do we make sure we survive? So what's wrong with that? Courtney, what's wrong with that?
Bad things happen to people who do good things.
Well, that's true. So we should. So if bad things happen to good people, we should do the things that stop that from happening, because we want those people to flourish, right? We don't want them to be hurt. So that can evolve. That's like, of course.
So if murder is wrong.
Murder.
Killing somebody is wrong.
Yeah.
However, if somebody's wanting to kill me and they're in the act of doing it, it's my act of killing them morally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
you can take that into account.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So there could be lesser of two evils. You're commanded not to murder, not to kill. I mean, let's just say not to kill.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to kill you, you're justified. There's a bigger value that says that you have the right, you have the duty, and the moral value of good if you prevent him from murdering you, from killing you, right? Because if we all obey that, then all told, that will promote human flourishing, right? We'll survive. And so, and if we have this instituted, it's better that that somebody who's murderously intending to kill you is discouraged from doing that because they know that they're taking the risk that you'll kill them first. So it's against their survival for them to even attempt to murder you, because we have this overarching law that is ultimately about human flourishing, so survival, that is now has formed the moral law that don't kill somebody or don't murder somebody. And that's how we explain it. We don't need God. I don't need God for any of this, right? If I'm talking about survival of human beings.
So you're saying that there's an objective moral, though.
I am.
So, but if there's objective morals, you're confirming.
I'm saying, I'm putting on my atheist hat, and I'm saying, I don't need God to tell me what objective moral. I know that it's, that we've developed over time this body of morality, and actually it's been baked into our very being from the process of evolution, that the things that are moral are the things that promote human flourishing. So my question is that right? Can we explain? Yes, Daniel, solve this for us.
I think it's not right. 'Cause if we start forming things saying that because they're going to lead to human flourishing, then it will be, instead it will end up being subjective, not objective, according to what I think, because it will be dependent on human beings to determine what things will lead to human flourishing and what things are not going to lead to human flourishing.
Yeah.
So we'll end up, and that will end up changing from time to time to human adjusting the moral values to suit their case, which is not the case of an objective.
But couldn't I say this, that what you're talking about really is epistemology. It's like, how do we know? And we could argue about what is the best way to promote human flourishing. But what the objective moral is that we ought to promote human flourishing. How we get there? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this way, maybe that. That's epistemology. How do we know? But we all agree that we got to promote human flourishing. That's our objective. The flourishing of humans is objectively good. And so that's our standard.
Okay, what do you say about the things that are not promoting human flourishing?
Yeah. What do you say about those things?
Because if you say you only lean towards things that are promoting human flourishing, what about the opposite? Because does it guarantee you that you do the opposite no matter what to keep the things that you're doing continue promoting human flourishing? Because does it mean if animals are going to affect you, so you go just destroying everything so long as it just keeps you flourishing no matter what? So to me, it has some question marks. It can't be that way. Because it's not just about human, it's about everything in the universe.
You're right. So think about this now. Let's say that human beings, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're polluting the world, we're burning all this fossil fuel, we're basically gonna kill the planet, right? Because there's gonna be runaway global warming, and we're already destroying the rainforest, and so you know what? It would actually be better if humans didn't exist. In fact, the world would be a better place if these stupid human beings weren't messing it all up. And so what does that line of thinking introduce? How does that affect? So maybe it's not human flourishing that's really that higher thing, right? So what does that say about the moral value? Well, first of all, do we believe that human flourishing is a good thing? Sure, it is a good thing. Okay, so we're not contesting that.
Yeah.
But why is it a good thing? What is the ontology of the moral value of human flourishing? here's the problem. And we're bumping up against it. The presumption of the evolutionist and the humanist, the presumption is that human flourishing is an objective moral good. Why? Why isn't it cockroach flourishing? Right? Why shouldn't it be cockroach flourishing that is really the ultimate good? You know, cockroaches adapt way better than human beings. They can live in any environment. They don't destroy the environment. They promote the environment. So why not cockroaches as being the ultimate moral good? And why don't we do everything to promote that? And why isn't it cockroach survival that instead of human survival that guides our moral law? Why isn't the Constitution oriented towards promoting the survival of cockroaches rather than giving human beings equal rights and all that stuff? This is the question that without God you can't answer, because ultimately there's no basis for the claim that, hey, human flourishing is the greatest good. That's just pulling it out of the air. Why is it human flourishing? Maybe it's human destruction because humans suck, right? We're evil and we're destroying the planet, and we're gonna, Earth is gonna turn into a dead Venus-like planet if we keep going, and we should stop. So get rid of all the humans. So here's the deal. The deal with evolved morals is that they bring the presumption of an objective morality that their system can't justify, right? You can start with saying that human flourishing or human survival is the greatest good, and then work from there, no problem. But how do you get there in the first place? How do you get to the point where you say it's human flourishing, really that's the greatest good? And what if you bring in the claim that actually it's humans glorifying God that's really the greatest good? Whether or not we're flourishing, whether or not we're comfortable, it's that we're glorifying God that is the main thing. So all of this to say that what we're looking for is a solid anchor to start with. Why do we have any moral value that we have, and what gives it its moral weight? What gives it its moral value or duty? And if we tie it to human flourishing, we have to ask, well, why is it human flourishing? The only way, and being contingent beings, being not infinite beings, there's no real reason to say that that's what's good or bad in and of itself. Okay, so that's a quick answer. Well, it wasn't very quick, but that is an answer to the claim that these objective moral values and duties could have evolved, or they're just by definition something that promotes human flourishing. The question is, why is human flourishing, why is human survival really that moral good in the first place? It is. I'm not denying that it isn't, but reasoning from evolution or reasoning from definition isn't an answer. It has to have a deeper answer than that. You have to have a foundation. And we'll argue that that foundation is God, which is why if God doesn't exist, then these things really don't exist, no matter how you try and fish around and create them. Another objection can be this, that these things that we call objective morals exist kind of like mathematical objects exist. Like when we say 1 + 1 is 2, well, that's true. And it's not a physical thing. We can't like see, we can write it in words, but the truth of that is this abstract thing that exists somewhere. And there's a whole realm of of abstract objects like mathematical laws, and objective morals are just part of that whole world of abstract objects. They just exist in the same way that objective mathematical laws exist. And they exist as necessary things. They cannot not exist. They have to exist. So that's another claim, is that we don't know exactly why they exist, but we know for sure that they do exist. But they don't owe their existence to God. They just exist as abstract objects, just like mathematical objects. Now, I would answer this by saying, well, even mathematical laws owe their existence to the mind of God, who can have concepts like mathematical laws, and that then we can see them. So even these, even if they do exist as abstract objects out in, abstract land, they still owe their existence to ultimately the mind of God, who has the capacity to think them and therefore bring them into being. The key question for the atheist ends up being this, is how do we go from statements of is, a description of the way things are, okay, like when you stab somebody with a knife, you are murdering them. That's a statement of description. You stab somebody, they die. To ought, statements of ought. When you stab somebody with a knife, that is a bad thing because you've just murdered. How do we go in a materialistic, atheistic world without God providing the foundational support of anything moral? How do we go from a description to a prescription, from an is to an ought? Okay, descriptive statements versus prescriptive statements. Descriptive describes the way things are. Prescriptive describes how they ought to be. What's really interesting is how easily people flow from descriptive to prescriptive. So you'll have a naturalist who is claiming that there are no objective morals, and in the same breath they'll say, and you Christians shouldn't be going around telling people, that they do exist, because they don't exist. And so you're going, well, how did you get from there they don't exist and everything is just a description of the way we behave? How did you get from there to a prescription that I shouldn't be making this claim, or that I'm wrong in presenting this argument? So you'll find that happening often. Last thing on this, in terms of definitions and just getting our minds around it, is we have to be careful, in the same way slipping between descriptive things and prescriptive things. We've got to be a little bit careful about what's called equivocating, using the same word but meaning two different things. With the idea of good, the word good has at least two different senses that we typically work with it in. And that is, we can use good as a moral value, like it is good to love your neighbor. Okay? But we can also use good as indicating that whatever the thing is effective towards its purpose. So like, I always thought that a good way to murder somebody would be to use like an icicle, right? So if you use an icicle and stab somebody and then just walk away, the icicle is going to melt, right? So the murder weapon just disappears. And who are you, how's anybody ever going to track me down? My fingerprints won't stick to it. So a good way to murder somebody is by stabbing them with a icicle. So that's using good in the sense of it's an effective way towards a purpose, the purpose being that I get away with murder, right? But it's not using good in the sense that that's a good thing. In fact, that's a terrible thing. So be careful about that. And you'll find, too, that when you're listening to dialogues about good and evil, oftentimes people will flow through those two definitions, and they'll mix them up, and it'll confuse the argument. I'm thinking more in terms of if you watch, and it's fascinating to watch debates on this particular thing. There's a lot of good debates on YouTube that you can watch, and you can pay attention to how tight the arguments are and where people go astray. So going from is to ought, using good and evil, or good in those two different senses. Okay, so one last thing I want to deal with, and then I'm going to stop because I really got to hit the road. And keep in mind, next week we'll come back and we'll complete this argument and tie it together. Right now I'm kind of throwing out a bunch of concepts for you to think about. But here's another objection to this first premise, where it's making the claim that objective morals only exist if God exists, or conversely, if God doesn't exist, then they don't exist. And this is a famous story that was told by Plato, who was a philosopher. Plato, by the way, is the father of the concept of abstract objects. We've talked about abstract objects. So in Plato's mind, he placed objective morality in the realm of abstract objects, and he called that realm the good. Okay, that's what he called it. So Plato was posing this dilemma, and he called Euthyphro's dilemmas. So Euthyphro comes and he's asking the question about the nature of good, and he asks this. He sees a dilemma. It's like, on the one hand this, but on the other hand this, and neither of them seem right. So which one is it? So on the one hand, he asks a question about the nature of the good. He says, is something good simply because God wills it? In other words, if God wills it, that's good. That's how we know what good is. And he says that if that's true, then it seems arbitrary, in the sense that, well, what if God had willed it that torturing babies for fun is good? Then would we say that is good? Well, probably not, right? So it's not just because God wills it that something is good. On the other hand, does God will something because it's good? Okay, so is it either defined as good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? And if it's the latter, if it's God's willing something because it's good, then God is referring to something else, this good thing. He's referring to that to decide what his will is going to be. Okay? So in this case, it seems like there's something besides God that is the source informing God, saying, oh, I see what the good is, so that's my will. And on the other hand, it's like, whatever I say, that's good. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. And that seems to introduce, some other external source. So the answer to this question is actually pretty simple, and that is to say that it's actually not a dilemma. There's a third option. There's a third option, and that is this. And this is the Christian perspective. This is the theistic perspective. Is that it's not that something is good just because God wills it arbitrarily. And it's not that God is referring to something outside of himself that is the source of that, but rather it is the very nature of God that he is good. He is good. He is the definition. His being is the definition. So it's in his nature to command that which is good. His will reflects his nature. And so, yes, he's referring to the good, but guess what? He's referring to himself because he is the source of good. So his goodness is the source of all moral values and duties, and they're expressed by his commands. So up here, this idea that, this question, if God had willed that torturing babies is good, then that would be good. Well, that is an inherent contradiction because it is against God's nature to torture babies. So this is like a square circle, this statement. It's kind of like, well, if God had created a square circle, what would the area of the circle be? It's like, well, it's a incoherent question because you can't have a square circle. You can't have a God willing that torturing babies is good. That just doesn't work because it's in his nature to be the good, and so that everything flowing out of his nature is his will, and he wills it because that's his nature. And here's the surprising thing. As you go out and become apologists and grow and everything, you'll find a lot of philosophers. In fact, I was riding my bike yesterday, listening to a debate between a theist and an atheist. And the atheist was a very famous philosopher, Pete Singer. You'll run into him if you do any kind of further work in apologetics or philosophy. And he brought up this very, very dilemma. And, it's amazing to me that they bring it up knowing full well that there is the solution here. And the fact that they don't acknowledge that solution just eludes me. It's kind of like I can't understand how cosmologists and biologists don't recognize the design they find in the universe and in biology. It's like, wow, are you guys blind? It's like, hey, here's this dilemma, but there's a solution. There's a way to resolve this. Why don't you talk about this? Talk about why this doesn't work. Okay, so there you go. Next week, we're going to finish up the moral argument because we've only gotten halfway. Read chapter 7. It's going to start talking about the problem of evil and suffering, keying us up for that. Watch this video here. By the way, this is already posted on Populi. Watch this short video. It's a recap of the moral argument. It'll hopefully make sense. So, and then next week, remember, we're doing the midterm review. So I'm going to give you everything. We'll have covered those first 4 things, those 2 cosmological arguments, the teleological in 2 forms, and then now we'll finish up the moral argument. So it'll be all ready to go home, get it done, and email me that by, I think I said Monday. Then last but not least, I forgot that I actually wanted your research paper topic today, but get it to me before next class. So I want to know what your proposed topic is so that we can make sure it's looking good for that. Okay? All right. Yes, sir.
Can you review the research again?
Yes, the research paper. Number 1, it's going to be about 7 pages. Number 2, it can be any topic that is apologetically minded. So you can pick any one of the arguments we've already dealt with. You can go into a detail of that, or if there's just something that is on your mind. I've had a couple of the Uganda students come back. One is going to be doing it on the resurrection of Christ. Okay, this will be an interesting one, as I understand her topic, and I need to work with her a little bit, is having to do with basically why is Jesus the only way? What about all the other religions? Why can't they lead to God? Why can't we get to heaven through the other religions? So something like that. You could do it on the problem of evil. How do you explain when somebody says, I don't believe in God Because if God existed, there wouldn't be all this evil and suffering. And I personally, whatever. My mom died of a terrible disease and she suffered for, a year. I just can't believe that a good God would let that happen to my mom. And if he exists, I don't like him. Because look what he allowed to happen to my mom. How do you answer that question? That is a tough question. It can be answered. Okay, there are great answers to this, but because they hit emotionally, and they are tough, presenting that argument or defending against that particular argument is a challenge, and we need to know how to do that. Okay, so pick a topic that is challenging. Could be on, it should be something that you're personally interested in, for sure. That you would maybe you don't have the answer, but use this research paper as an opportunity to dig and find a good answer. It could be on a good one that we contend with often is, how do we understand the days of Genesis? Okay, so big possible conflict between what science discovers about about God's revelation in nature versus what He's revealed in the first chapter or the first 2 chapters of Genesis. A plain reading of that says that, hey, God did this on one day, this on the other day, and if days are days, well, that's 6 days. And, if you add up all the genealogies, we're talking about 6,000 to 10,000 years, depending how you slice it. That is a very short amount of time, really, and all of the evidence, and I can attest to this, all of the evidence in nature, in God's revelation, seems to say that those days were really, really long days. They weren't just like 24 hours. So how do we contend with that? Especially when we are making our arguments like from cosmology. How do we utilize those arguments effectively, and how do we address that? So that could be a topic. And if you run out of, if by the 8th you just are still struggling, don't worry. I'll help you. I'll give you. I'll talk your topic out of you. Right? How do we? Here's a great one. You could write this. This would be an awesome paper, especially for you. How do we grow a new generation of apologists in Africa? What's the best way to do that? Okay. All right. I have to hit the road. So thanks for joining us. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
All right. Bye-bye. Ishaka, I'm going to try and post this right away. Bye.